A 19-year-old girl was accused of heresy, tied to the stake, and burned alive. To prevent the French from retrieving her remains and turning her into a saint, the English ordered her body to be burned repeatedly until it was reduced to ashes and completely destroyed. She was the French heroine Joan of Arc, an illiterate village girl who led an army to save the people from war and suffering, only to be betrayed by her own countrymen because her achievements overshadowed those in power, and eventually died at the hands of the English. When talking about Joan of Arc in the Middle Ages, it's impossible to avoid mentioning the 100 Years' War between England and France. In this war over the right to the throne, France suffered continuous defeats. With large territories falling into English hands, it was one of the darkest periods in French history. Everyone believed that only a miracle could save France, and according to an ancient prophecy, the one who would bring that miracle must be a virgin from Lorraine. At that time, Joan of Arc was still a carefree village girl, living in a French village called Dauphin, and her biggest hobby every day was running to the church to confess to the priest. She even wished she could live inside the church. The priest got a headache every time he saw her, because she often confessed about trivial things, like giving her shoes to a poor monk without her father's permission even though her father had already forgiven her. She still wanted to confess again to receive God's forgiveness. The priest always cooperated helplessly, and in those moments, the girl felt as sweet as if she had drunk honey, running freely through the fields of hope. Even if she tumbled down a hill, her mood remained unaffected. After rolling a few times and looking up at the sky, a divine miracle appeared. The wind roared, clouds churned, and every sound became clear: the wind, the church bells, the rustling, all resonating together. Most miraculous of all was the calling from God. When she opened her eyes again, a sword lay quietly on the grass beside her. Perhaps out of curiosity, she picked up the sword and pointed it to the sky. And in that instant, another miracle happened. She was suddenly transported from the field to a forest. A pack of vicious wolves ran wildly past her, charging toward the village. Joan of Arc, holding the sword, chased after them, only to see that the once peaceful and happy village had been reduced to a sea of flames by the English army. Ruins everywhere, with bodies strewn all over the ground. Terrified, she still mustered the courage to run back to find her parents. The sound of her sister knocking over a stool accidentally alerted everyone inside and outside the house. As the sound of galloping horses grew closer, the sister gave up the only hiding spot to her younger sibling, leaving herself completely exposed to the approaching English soldiers. The sight of a young and innocent French girl made three ruthless brutes burst into sinister laughter, and so, the sister was assaulted and murdered by them, while Joan of Arc, hiding behind the door, witnessed the entire tragedy, a shadow that would haunt her forever, a wound that could never be healed. After committing such horrific acts, the English army left the village. The survivors held a funeral for the innocent victims, and Joan of Arc watched as her sister's body was gradually buried, while the seed of hatred began to grow and take root in her heart, especially the moment when the cross was inserted into the ground. Her once unwavering faith collapsed in an instant. If God does not help me, then I will become God. I guess this must have been her true feeling at the time. To help Joan of Arc recover, the villagers sent her away from the place of trauma to live with her aunt. But as a young child, she couldn't walk out of the shadow of what happened. She hid inside the house, refused to see anyone, and stayed awake through the nights, which made her aunt and uncle deeply worried. "I want to see a priest." That was the first thing she said after her sister died. Helplessly, her aunt accompanied her on a long journey to a distant church. There, she found a way to release her inner grief. She wanted to confess, "It shouldn't have been my sister who died. It should have been me." As someone who had been saved, a survivor, Joan of Arc didn't know how to reconcile with herself. She needed to find the meaning of being alive. Faced with the emotionally devastated Joan of Arc, the priest offered his understanding and guidance.
The Lord always has a good reason. Perhaps He chose you because He needs you for some higher calling. So, as long as you answer that call, your sister will not have died in vain.
His words became her lifeline, but she didn't want to remain a passive soul waiting to be called. So, while her aunt and uncle weren't paying attention, she jumped off the carriage and ran alone through the wild forest for dozens of miles. In the pouring rain, she returned to the very church where she had confessed. Amid thunder and lightning, she drank the Holy Communion. In that moment, her lips turned blood red, as if biting into the mark left by the English. At that instant, she became the messenger of God. Years later, with her unshakable belief in being with God, Joan of Arc had grown into someone with power. She heard the voice of God, telling her to assist the French Dauphin in ascending the throne and save the people of France from peril. So she wrote a letter, calling herself the Virgin from Lorraine, claiming to bring the voice of God and requesting to meet Prince Charles in person. This letter caused an uproar in the French royal family. Relatives believed she was a witch and that it wasn't worth the risk for Charles to see her. But the Queen Mother opposed everyone's objections and fully supported the Dauphin in receiving Joan of Arc. Her words convinced Charles. The long-discouraged people of France did indeed need a new spiritual symbol in order to break through the English encirclement. So he agreed to meet this mysterious girl, but for the sake of safety, and to test her identity, he asked a trusted aide to disguise himself as the Dauphin and sit on the throne, while Charles himself hid among the crowd to see if she could identify the real one. If she could, he would believe her. To verify Joan of Arc's virginity, four maids held up the corners of a curtain, forming a makeshift virginity check room. Joan of Arc, dressed in a nightgown, stood inside to be examined. French nobles surrounded them to prevent any trickery or confusion. After all was set, a stern-faced female physician gestured with her hand, signaling the maids to lift her skirt. The nightgown was raised to her upper thighs, fully exposing the girl's straight legs. The physician reached in, parted Joan of Arc's legs, looked carefully for a moment, and quickly came to an authoritative conclusion. There is no sign of corruption or violation. She is intact. As soon as she finished speaking, the crowd erupted. Joan of Arc, who had passed the test, looked even more determined. This wasn't the first trial she had faced. On her way to meet the Dauphin, Charles had already set a trap. He had his aide dress in royal robes and pretend to be him, while Charles himself hid among the crowd, waiting to see her make a fool of herself. But unexpectedly, Joan of Arc saw through their disguise instantly. I can see you are a good man, but you're not the Dauphin. After speaking, she began scanning the crowd. Under the gaze of all, she walked directly toward the man hiding in the corner. The knives placed at the man's neck told her the truth. As soon as the guards released her, she threw herself forward and hugged the man's leg. Leaning close to Charles's ear, she whispered that she had brought a message from heaven, one that could only be spoken to him. A village girl had no way of knowing what the Dauphin looked like. Charles began to believe her. Despite everyone's objections, he took Joan of Arc into a private room to hear her describe the details of her communication with God. The miracles Joan of Arc described felt too real. Her account of the coronation was also incredibly compelling. Charles went from skeptical to completely convinced. His ambition was reignited. He believed Joan of Arc was the chosen one and promised to assign her a powerful army. After leaving the secret room, Charles personally arranged for attendants to house and protect Joan of Arc 24/7. Now trusted, Joan of Arc immediately had someone draft a letter to the King of England. Speaking as God's messenger, she demanded that the English retreat from Orleans immediately. But on Charles's side, his resolve began to waver again under the persuasion of advisors and confidants. So, a second test was arranged, this time from a scientific perspective, to verify whether she was the prophesied saint who would perform miracles. After passing both trials, the church also stepped in, demanding that she provide proof to convince everyone. Facing doubts, Joan of Arc responded, "I am not here to perform tricks. You are all far smarter than I am, and you should know better. While the blood of the French people flows like rivers, you sit here in fine clothes trying to deceive me. But the truth is, you're just lying to yourselves." As soon as she said this, the entire room fell silent. No one wanted to be the first to stand against her, and no one wanted to become a sinner in the eyes of history. With that, a final decision was made. Joan of Arc would lead a supply of food and troops, scraped together from the nearly empty royal treasury, on an urgent mission to reinforce the defenders of Orleans. When the commanders in Orleans learned that she was a girl, they reacted with disdain. If it weren't for the food supplies and troops she brought, they wouldn't have paid her any attention. However, the reality far exceeded their expectations. The moment Joan of Arc entered the city, she was met with a warm welcome from the war-weary people. Those who had struggled in the swamps for so long would never let go of a long-awaited lifeline. But Joan of Arc's challenges were only just beginning. Having never received any military training and being illiterate, the little girl who couldn't read failed to earn the trust of the experienced commanders. They couldn't outright reject her, so they simply ignored her, which made Joan of Arc furious, and she threw a small tantrum in front of everyone. After shouting, under everyone's astonished gaze, she pointed at a spot on the map and told them, "Cross the river and attack here." But based on the general's experience, this was completely impossible. Trellis was impregnable and could never be taken. Joan of Arc later realized that they didn't care whether she was God's messenger. As long as she remained a girl, they would never take her words seriously, so she slapped one of the men who had mocked her and made an important decision. Furious about being looked down on because of her gender, Joan of Arc grabbed a dagger and violently cut off her golden hair, making herself look more like a man. Then, with short hair, clad in armor, riding a warhorse, and holding a banner, she rushed alone to the battlefield and charged into the fray. Under her inspiration, the soldiers snapped out of their gloom. Their morale soared, and the enemy, startled, began retreating back into the fortress. Joan of Arc didn't want to waste this rare opportunity. She threw her banner to a subordinate, pulled the reins tight, and galloped toward the enemy, shouting loudly as she crossed the barriers. She drew her longsword and slashed through the ropes of the drawbridge. The soldiers surged forward, successfully crossed the river, and engaged in brutal combat with the English troops. With relentless force, they climbed the walls and cut down the enemy's flag, successfully retaking Turellis. Joan of Arc's first victory left everyone stunned. Even the commander who had looked down on her the most handed her a battle flag in person, acknowledging her combat skills and inviting her to join in strategy discussions.
First, we find the biggest army we can. Then we return to Orléans.
It sounded like a fantasy, but remembering the miracles this girl had already performed, they chose to believe. And just as Joan of Arc had said, the English were accelerating the construction of a bridge. The arrival of France's main forces caught the arrogant English off guard, prompting them to report immediately to their highest-ranking general. He looked at the young girl outside the city walls who had delivered the challenge letter, and scoffed in disbelief. He simply reinforced the city's defenses. After delivering her challenge, Joan of Arc continued to rally the troops. Every exhausted soldier was reinvigorated by her presence, charging toward the fortress with renewed strength, and the great battle officially began. However, the English troops were better equipped than expected. Massive stones rained down continuously, and countless soldiers were taken out by the impacts. The two sides were locked in a deadlock. To find a breakthrough to victory, Joan of Arc charged forward holding her banner. Just as she was about to reach the top, she was struck in the chest by an English arrow and fell on the spot. The English thought Joan of Arc was dead and finally breathed a sigh of relief. But back in the camp, the girl opened her eyes under the worried gazes of the soldiers and pulled the arrow from her body with her own hands as if nothing had happened. Then, she passed out completely. The sudden incident startled the troops, who immediately brought in the military doctor for treatment. After examination, the doctor found that she was simply asleep. But Joan of Arc's sleep was far from peaceful. In her dream, she was surrounded by a black fog, and even the ever-present god had disappeared. Then she suddenly found herself inside a tunnel, holding a torch and walking deeper in. At the tunnel's end, she witnessed once again the horrific scene of her sister's assault and death. She woke up in a surge of hatred and grief, and once again, a miracle occurred. She had fully recovered. Walking out of the room, she saw soldiers lying all over the ground. They had lost morale after she was injured. Across the tower, the English, thinking they had already won, were gleeful and arrogant.
Reggie! Reggie! We sent the little bitch back to hell!
Hearing their insulting words, Joan of Arc's hatred intensified. She went around waking up the sleeping soldiers one by one, launching a new round of attacks. This time, she didn't rush in recklessly but led with coordination and strategy. Under her command, an abandoned siege tower was repositioned and rebuilt, facing away from the English troops. No one understood what she was doing. The English commander even mocked. What a madwoman, she doesn't even know how to use a siege tower. Just as the words left his mouth, Joan of Arc proved him wrong. With a single command, the abandoned tower slammed directly into the English fortifications, smashing open a breach. The soldiers immediately responded, breaking through the English front line and forcing them to close the city gates. Retreating like frightened turtles, Joan of Arc countered their every move and then resorted to fire attacks. The battle between England and France entered a full-blown stage. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but nothing could stop the soaring morale of the French. The city gates finally broke. The French soldiers, in a bloodthirsty frenzy, rushed in. The blazing flames and searing heat were no match for the burning blood flowing through their veins. For the first time in nearly half a century, they finally felt like real men. The English were defeated. Corpses were scattered across the battlefield, and Joan of Arc was thunderstruck by the brutal scene. Her blood-stained hands seemed to be a silent warning. What kind of god would demand such slaughter? If not God, then whose work was this? But the English didn't give her much time to think. Their reinforcements arrived. This time, Joan of Arc didn't launch a direct assault. Instead, she went to the enemy camp alone, hoping to convince them with reason to win without a fight. Seeing the victorious French soldiers not far away, the English troops slowly began to retreat. France had won. The news that Orleans is free spread quickly. The French Dauphin was overjoyed, while the King of England swore to destroy Joan of Arc and burn her in the Square of England. Joan of Arc, who had led France to a revival in morale, became a divine figure in the hearts of the people. Crowds lined the streets to welcome her return. Charles, under her watchful gaze, was successfully crowned king. France entered a period of peaceful development, and no longer needed to create a god to reclaim its territory. But while Joan of Arc was still charging at the front lines, her king had already abandoned her.
Son, that is not 10,000 reinforcements! That is 100 very loyal but very tired soldiers! Don't you understand? He doesn't want this war anymore. He has his crown now. That's all he ever wanted.
Betrayed by her own side, Joan of Arc stormed back to the French palace in anger and barged into the royal chamber. Demanding an explanation, Charles flatly denied having sent any troops, and laughed her off. He and his confidants believed that without military support, Joan of Arc would quietly return to her village life. But the country girl, who felt her mission was not yet complete, decided to use her influence to recruit soldiers and build an army of her own to attack Burgundy. This alarmed the nobles. Using the excuse that Joan of Arc had disrupted peace talks, they persuaded Charles to join forces with the Burgundian nobility to deal with her. They laid a trap and captured her in Compiègne. Charles hesitated.
Worry, Shah. If God is still with her, she will be victorious.
Fight fire with fire that perfectly described their hypocrisy. If Joan of Arc won, it was because God was with her. If she lost, then her faith wasn't strong enough. Through their shameless schemes, Joan of Arc was ambushed while fighting for her country, trapped outside the city gates, surrounded. Her loyal followers were slaughtered, and she was pulled from her horse and captured. After fainting, she felt like vines were binding her, slowly draining her life. When she awoke in fear, a mysterious man in black appeared beside her. He said, "Death is an interesting thing. In a few months, you'll be just a pile of bones. A year later, you'll vanish into the air." Then he began changing faces. All of them were the faces of God Joan of Arc had seen in her dreams. Then he returned to his original form.
How can you possibly imagine that God, the creator of heaven and earth, the source of all life, could possibly need you?
Joan of Arc was shaken. If it wasn't the call of God, then who was it? As she examined her heart, the soldiers who once followed her heard of her capture and raised a ransom of 10,000 francs. They handed it to the king, hoping he would redeem her. At that time, all prisoners could be ransomed with money, but their rescue failed. The English offered a higher price and took her instead. To destroy Joan of Arc's sacred image among the people, they quickly set up a religious court, deciding to try her as a heretic. They wanted to label her a witch, and from the spiritual level, wipe out France's symbol of hope and erase Joan of Arc's image among the people. Under the guise of religion, political henchmen compiled 70 charges against Joan of Arc in a matter of months. They were determined to put her to death. Among the most absurd accusations were things like wearing men's clothing and leaving parental supervision without permission. During the trial, Joan of Arc insisted that she was called by God, and that Charles VII was the only true king of France. She had never betrayed her country, her people, or her faith. According to historical records, there was a famous question during the trial: "Do you believe you have received the grace of God?" This was a trap church doctrine at the time, held that no one could be certain they had received God's grace. If she answered yes, she would prove herself a heretic. If she answered no, she would admit to being guilty. Joan of Arc replied, "If I have not, may God grant it to me. If I have, may God continue to grant it." The entire courtroom was stunned by her answer, and they had to suspend the trial that day. A righteous priest withdrew from the proceedings and tried to report the injustice to the Pope in Italy, but he was imprisoned by order of the English King Henry. And so, Joan of Arc was forcibly branded a schismatic and a witch. But due to the restrictions of the medieval religious court, she could not be executed immediately. They had to wait for her to relapse after a chance to repent. So they found a new angle exploiting her illiteracy. They tricked her into signing a document renouncing heresy. That little X gave the English their chance to kill her. That night, a group of English soldiers stormed her prison cell, tore off her women's clothing, and left her only a set of men's clothes which, once worn, would mark her as a heretic. Joan of Arc's religious beliefs forbade her from being exposed, so she had no choice but to put on the men's clothes left behind. Under the influence of the English king's narrative, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake on May 31, 1431, in the central square of Rouen, charged with heresy. On the night before her execution, Joan of Arc wandered the prison, just like when she was a child, looking for a priest to hear her final confession. That mysterious man in black appeared once more, pretending to be a priest to listen to her voice.
I've committed sins, my lord. So many sins. I saw so many signs, the ones I wanted to see, out of revenge and despair. I was all the things that people believe they are allowed to be when they're fighting for.
In Luc Besson's version of the story, Joan of Arc is portrayed as a flesh and blood, rational human being. In the end, she admitted that out of hatred and selfishness, she may have imagined or fabricated the identity of God's messenger, convincing the Dauphin and countless followers to fight the English to avenge her sister. But no matter what, no one can erase Joan of Arc's role in shaping the French national spirit. It was only after her that France truly began to have a national identity. I'm a movie enthusiast. Thank you for watching. See you next time.